Imagine walking into a courtroom, right? You're there to prosecute a murder. The defendant is sitting right there at the table.
Right. The jury is seated. Everyone has their notebooks out. The judge drops the gavel.
Exactly. The trial begins.
Yeah.
But when you look over the evidence table, it's completely empty.
Just bare?
Yeah. There's no murder weapon. There are no crime scene photos showing, a tragic end. And most terrifyingly of all, for a prosecutor, there is no body.
Right. I mean, you are asking 12 ordinary people to send a man to prison for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
Based entirely on an invisible crime.
It's wild. Today, we are unpacking a truly unprecedented 10,584-day investigation.
Which is really the absolute zenith of prosecutorial difficulty. I mean, you're stepping into a legal landscape where the physical anchor of the crime simply does not exist.
And hasn't existed for nearly 30 years. Welcome to the deep dive. We're taking on a mission of, honestly, staggering scale today.
Yeah, it's massive.
It starts on a quiet summer morning in August of 1996 with an 11-year-old girl named Trudy Appleby. And it culminates in a massive, high-stakes 2026 legal battle.
And as we just mentioned, the thing that makes this entire situation so unprecedented is that they're doing all of this without a single piece of physical remains.
Which completely rewrites the forensic and legal playbook,
Oh, absolutely. This case isn't just about the profound tragedy of what happened to Trudy in the 1990s. It's really a masterclass in how community persistence, rapidly changing forensic technology, and the highly complex psychology of witness trauma all just violently collide.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we have a tremendous amount of ground to cover today.
We really do.
We're going to construct a chronological roadmap of the Trudy Appleby investigation. We're going to decipher how the local methamphetamine trade of the mid-90s turned a missing persons case into, well, a targeted retaliatory kidnapping.
Right, which shifts the whole paradigm.
And we are going to explore the extraordinary forensic and legal hurdles of prosecuting a nobody homicide in the state of Illinois. But before we get into the timeline, I want you, the listener, to just think about something for a second.
It's a heavy thought.
It really is. Imagine holding on to a terrifying, dangerous secret, not for a week, not for a month, but for 30 years.
Yeah, just sitting with that.
Imagine the psychological weight of knowing who took a child and being too terrified to say a word. Because that specific brand of fear is the emotional bedrock of everything we are about to discuss today.
It's a critical foundation for us to lay down right now, honestly. In most criminal investigations, the passage of time is the enemy.
Right. Memories fade.
Exactly. Physical evidence degrades, witnesses move away or, pass on. But here, as we'll see as we move through this timeline, the passage of time is actually the singular mechanism that allowed the truth to finally surface.
Which is mind-blowing. Let's wind the clock all the way back to August 21st, 1996. We're in Moline, Illinois.
Right in the Quad Cities area.
Yeah, for those who aren't familiar, it's situated right on the border of Iowa and Illinois, divided by the Mississippi River. It's a Wednesday morning, the summer before the school year starts.
A classic summer day.
Trudy Appleby is 11 years old. Her father, Dennis Appleby, leaves for work, leaving Trudy home alone.
And we have to set the stage a bit here, because looking at this through a modern lens, people might ask, why an 11-year-old was left alone for the whole day?
Right. People judge that now.
Yeah, but in 1996, this was incredibly common. The latchkey kid generation was in full swing.
It was entirely normalized within the culture of the era. I mean, you didn't have ubiquitous cell phones or GPS tracking apps.
No Life 360 back then.
Exactly. Parents went to work, kids stayed home, watched TV, or rode their bikes around the neighborhood until the streetlights came on. And the initial hours of Trudy's disappearance were completely masked by this illusion of a perfectly normal summer day.
Right. She was actually supposed to meet a friend of hers, Amber, around 8:30 in the morning. They had plans, but Amber simply overslept. Yeah, and when Amber finally wakes up a bit later and tries to get a hold of Trudy, likely calling the landline, getting no answer, that is the first tiny, almost imperceptible fracture in the routine.
The first sign that something is off.
Ah.
But the real anchor point of this entire timeline, the moment that investigators would just obsess over for the next 3 decades, happens at 9:30 a.m.
The driveway sighting.
Yes. A neighbor happens to be looking out their window and spots Trudy in her own driveway. But she's not alone.
No, she's seen getting into a silver or gray box-style 4-door sedan.
A lot of the source material compares the look of the car to a Chevy Cavalier, which, was absolutely everywhere on the roads in the 90s.
Right, super common car. And the driver is described as a white male in his 20s with dark curly hair wearing a baseball cap.
And we have to analyze that single visual because it's the only concrete piece of spatial data investigators had.
It's important to look at the conflict that happened right before this moment, too.
Oh, right, with her dad.
Yeah, Trudy had explicitly asked her father if she could go swimming that day at a place called Campbell's Island. It's a small, somewhat insular residential island in the Mississippi River right next to East Moline.
And her father, Dennis, explicitly told her, no, you can't go.
But as anyone who has ever been or raised an 11-year-old knows, parental guidelines are often viewed as mere suggestions.
Oh, absolutely, which is exactly what the evidence suggests she did.
Right. Subsequent analysis of the home's phone records by the Moline police strongly indicated that Trudy fully intended to go to Campbell's Island anyway. She was making active plans to get out there.
So she gets into this silver sedan with a man in his 20s, and she just vanishes. For the rest of August 21st, no one sees her.
Just gone.
By the evening, Dennis Appleby comes home, realizes she isn't there. He initially hoped she might be, camping with her mother. But when that is ruled out, the absolute panic sets in.
A nightmare begins.
Now, I want to talk about the cultural climate of the 1990s for a second. When a child vanished back then, the immediate, overwhelming public assumption, fueled by the media, milk carton campaigns and high-profile cases, was stranger danger.
Yeah, that was the prevailing cultural anxiety. The white van, the stranger offering candy.
The boogeyman.
Exactly. It was a terrifying, chaotic concept because it meant violence was random and unpredictable. But if we analyze those initial hours of the Appleby investigation objectively, breaking down the mechanics of the abduction...
The breadcrumbs were pointing in a completely different direction.
Right. It wasn't random.
It's like looking for a needle in a haystack, but then realizing the needle was actually stolen by someone who knew exactly where the haystack was, who built the haystack, and who had a key to the barn.
That's a great way to put it.
I mean, they didn't just stumble upon her walking down a random road. They knew she was home, they knew the neighborhood, they pulled right into her driveway.
That analogy hits the nail on the head. The specific geographic focus on Campbell's Island, combined with the fact that she willingly approached and got into the vehicle in broad daylight in her own driveway.
She clearly wasn't dragged into the car.
Right, this wasn't a chaotic snatch and grab by a transient predator. This pointed to a much smaller, insular world. She likely knew the person, or at the very least, recognized them as someone firmly connected to her family's orbit.
But the stranger danger narrative completely hijacked the early public understanding of the case. Everyone was looking for a monster in the shadows, when the reality was much closer to home.
A lot closer.
To understand why someone Trudy knew or someone her family knew would pull into her driveway on a Wednesday morning and take her, we have to pull back the curtain on the socioeconomic reality of the Quad Cities in the mid-90s.
Which requires us to shift our focus from the abduction itself to the underlying motive. This is where the narrative pivots from a tragic missing persons case into something much more systemic and calculated.
Let's fast forward just for a moment to the recent court filings from November 2025. Jamie Fisher is indicted for Trudy's murder.
Right.
And in these pretrial motions, the prosecution explicitly lays out the alleged motive. It wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a drug debt.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of the 1990s Midwest, you have to understand the explosion of the local methamphetamine trade.
Which was huge back then.
Massive. Before the era of these massive super labs south of the border dominating the market, you had these incredibly volatile, small-scale distribution networks moving product across state lines, particularly in border areas like the Quad Cities.
And the prosecution's filings allege that Jamison Fisher, who was 22 years old at the time, and his associate, an older man named David Whipple, were acting as drug connects.
Right.
So define drug connects in this context for us. How did that economy actually function?
Well, in that localized economy, a connect is essentially a mid-level distributor. They aren't cooking it themselves, but they have a reliable source.
They're the middlemen.
Exactly. According to the state, Fisher and Whipple were moving meth from Muscatine, Iowa, across the river into the Quad Cities area. They operate entirely on a shadow economy of credit and debt. They front the product to local buyers or lower-level dealers with the expectation of payment later.
And here's where the story turns just devastating. The state alleges that Dennis Appleby, Trudy's father, was a customer.
Yeah.
He was purchasing meth from Fisher and Whipple's network.
And Crucially, the state's theory is that Dennis Appleby owed them a significant amount of money. He was in debt to his connects.
Which is a dangerous place to be.
Very. And in the illicit drug trade, you cannot exactly take someone to small claims court when they fail to pay.
Right, you can't just call the cops.
No, you have to rely on violence, intimidation, and leverage. The kidnapping of 11-year-old Trudy was an act of extreme leverage. It was designed to force the payment of that drug debt.
I really want the listener to sit with that for a second. It completely upends the initial 1996 narrative.
It really does.
This wasn't an impulsive, predatory crime committed by a passing stranger. This was premeditated criminal retribution. It was a business transaction in the underworld that escalated into an absolute catastrophe.
From a legal standpoint, that shift is seismic. It changes the entire framework of intent. In a court of law, if you want to secure a first-degree murder conviction, proving premeditation and motive is paramount.
You have to explain the why.
Exactly. The state isn't just saying Fisher killed her. They're explaining exactly why he had a calculated reason to take her in the first place. And to prove that this was his standard way of doing business, the prosecution is utilizing a very specific legal mechanism called Rule 404B evidence.
No, when I was reading through our sources on this 404B rule, it sounded a bit counterintuitive at first.
How so?
Usually, my understanding is that a jury isn't supposed to hear about a defendant's past unrelated crimes. It prejudices them, right? It's like a prosecutor saying, hey, this guy stole a car 5 years ago, so he definitely robbed this bank today.
Right.
The law usually says you can't do that. So how does this exception actually work here?
You're touching on the exact friction point of character evidence. You are absolutely correct. The law generally prohibits introducing prior bad acts simply to argue that the defendant has a bad character and a propensity to commit crimes.
Makes sense.
However, Rule 404B provides a very narrow, very powerful exception. You can introduce prior bad acts if those acts prove something specific. Motive, opportunity, intent, preparation, plan, knowledge, or absence of mistake.
So it's not about saying he's a bad guy in general. It's about saying he has a highly specific established pattern of solving his problems this exact way.
Precisely. It's about establishing a modus operandi. And in this trial, the prosecution intends to call a witness named Ron O'Haver to the stand.
And his testimony is pretty central to this.
It's devastating. He is expected to testify that Jamison Fisher had a clearly established history of taking collateral or ransom for unpaid drug debts.
And what kind of collateral are we talking about usually?
Usually, according to the filings, it meant property. Fisher would confiscate someone's expensive tools, or in some cases, he would literally steal their animals.
Like pets?
Yeah, holding them hostage until the buyer came up with the cash they owed him for the meth.
So if a guy owes you $200, you take his hunting dog or his power saw and say, you get this back when you pay me. That's his business model.
That's the allegation, yes.
But making the jump from stealing a power saw to kidnapping an 11-year-old girl, I mean, that is a staggering escalation.
It is a horrific escalation, obviously. But legally, it establishes a continuing narrative for the jury. It shows that leveraging something a debtor loves, whether it's property, an animal, or in this catastrophic instance, a child, was Fisher's standard operating procedure for collecting what he was owed.
It connects the dots.
Right. It provides the logical bridge for the jury to understand why a drug dealer would suddenly commit a kidnapping.
Okay, but this brings up a massive glaring question. If I'm sitting in that jury box, I am listening to this and thinking, wait a minute. If Fisher was operating like this, taking ransom, threatening people over drug debts, if his violent tactics were essentially an open secret in this local drug underworld, why did it take 3 decades for anyone to speak up?
And that is the crux of the defense's argument.
I mean, we are talking about 1996 to 2025. Why wait 29 years to put these pieces together on the record?
It brings us to a deep dive into the psychology of delayed reporting and witness trauma. The state of Illinois currently plans to call between 25 and 30 witnesses at this trial.
That's a huge witness list.
It is. And many of the key players in that group are individuals who held onto this horrific secret for decades.
Let's look at who these people actually are, because their proximity to the crime in 1996 is stunning.
Very close to the center.
You have a woman named Tiffany Fuller. In 1996, she was Jamison Fisher's girlfriend. She claims that she heard him confess to taking Trudy the very next morning after she disappeared, and she claims he explicitly cited the drug debt as the reason.
Right.
Then you have a man named Rodney Fouch, who was incarcerated alongside Fisher. He claims Fisher confessed to him not once, but twice, first in 1996, and then again in 2019, allegedly stating outright that he took and strangled a little girl.
And perhaps the most visually haunting testimony they have lined up comes from a woman named Mandy West. She was an associate and a neighbor in this circle.
What did she see?
She is expected to take the stand and testify that she saw Jamison Fisher carrying a lifeless young girl off a boat in August of 1996.
I'm sorry, I have to push back here.
Go ahead.
If I am on that jury,
Yeah,
I'm going to have a really hard time swallowing this. You saw a man carrying a lifeless child off a boat. A child whose face is on every billboard and milk carton in the county. And you waited until you had gray hair to tell the police.
It sounds unbelievable on the surface.
How does a prosecutor look a jury in the eye and say, trust this memory from 30 years ago? How do you prove they aren't making it up for a reward, or that their memories haven't completely degraded and warped over time?
It is a phenomenal question, and it is exactly the vulnerability the defense team will relentlessly attack. The defense strategy will absolutely hinge on the concept of memory degradation.
Right, memory isn't perfect.
They will bring in their own experts to testify that human memory is incredibly malleable, that 30 years is simply too long, that media saturation contaminated their recollections. You can't trust this, they will say.
So how does the state's attorney counter that? How do you make the jury believe them?
By meticulously explaining the psychology of extreme trauma, witness intimidation, and the unique dynamics of an ecosystem of violence.
The drug underworld environment.
Yes. The prosecution has to prove that the fear of Jamison Fisher was significantly more powerful than the natural degradation of memory. We have to look at the environment these witnesses were living in. They weren't suburban accountants. They were deeply embedded in a criminal network where violence was the primary currency.
It's not that they just forgot and then suddenly remembered while drinking their morning coffee one day. It's that they were absolutely paralyzed.
Precisely. Let's analyze Mandy West's situation specifically. She sees this horrific event, but she knows who Fisher is. She knows what he is capable of.
He's the guy who steals dogs and tools over $20.
Right. Going to the police in 1996 doesn't just feel risky. To her, it feels like an immediate death sentence. So she stays quiet out of absolute paralyzing terror. She internalizes the trauma, but then, decades later, there is a distinct turning point.
The incident in 2016.
Yes. In 2016, 20 years after Trudy disappeared, Jamison Fisher allegedly broke the windows of Mandy West's house.
Wow. Just out of nowhere.
Well, according to the psychological context that investigators rely on, this wasn't just a case of random vandalism. This specific, targeted act of violence acted as a massive trauma trigger.
It shattered the illusion of safety she had built up over 20 years.
Exactly. It bypassed her rational brain and triggered her survival instinct. It was the breaking point that finally pushed her to contact the Moline police.
She finally snapped.
She realized that the threat of Jamison Fisher was never going to passively fade away. He was still violent, he was still close by, and the only way to truly protect herself was to finally bring him down for what he did in 1996.
That reframes it entirely. So the prosecution isn't just presenting her memory of a single day in 1996. They're presenting a continuous 30-year timeline of persistent intimidation to logically explain the delay.
That is the key. They contextualize the silence. Tiffany Fuller, the ex-girlfriend, cited a profound ongoing fear for her own life.
I mean, naturally.
When you are sleeping next to a man you believe murdered an 11-year-old over a drug debt, you don't casually walk into a precinct. The prosecution will argue to the jury that these memories aren't faded at all. Rather, they are etched in absolute stone because of the profound trauma associated with holding them.
The silence wasn't a lack of memory. It was a survival tactic.
Right.
But eventually, as the years drag on, the police realized that waiting for these people to organically overcome their terror just wasn't working fast enough. They had to change their playbook.
They couldn't just sit back.
The passive approach of handing out missing person flyers and waiting for the tip line to ring wasn't going to solve a targeted underworld murder. They had to start actively turning up the heat on the people who knew what happened.
They had to transition from a search and rescue mindset to a strategic psychological pressure campaign. And this marks a massive, fascinating shift in how the Moline Police Department and eventually the FBI handled the intelligence gathering.
Let's trace this chronologically, because it's a brilliant look at cold case police strategy. The tactic here is essentially shaking the tree to see what falls out.
Good way to put it.
For years, the primary suspect internally the man investigators were looking at behind closed doors was a guy named William Ed Smith.
Yes. Ed Smith is a crucial piece of this puzzle. He lived out on Campbell's Island, the very place Trudy had asked to go swimming that morning.
Which connects right back to the beginning.
Exactly. He was a known associate within this drug network, and importantly, he was a family friend of the Applebys. Trudy knew him.
And even more damning, witnesses had actually placed Trudy in a silver sedan with Ed Smith near his Campbell's Island house on the very morning she vanished.
And if you track the vehicle, it gets even more suspicious. Smith owned a vehicle that perfectly matched the description of the boxy silver sedan seen in the driveway.
The Chevy Cavalier type car.
Right, and within a week of Trudy's disappearance, that specific vehicle was scrapped, destroyed.
Which is a massive, glaring red flag for evidence disposal. I mean, you don't scrap your daily driver a week after a kid goes missing in a car that looks just like it, unless you are scrubbing a crime scene.
No, you really don't.
But for years, the police just didn't have enough physical evidence to charge him, and in that criminal underworld, Smith wasn't going to talk. So they hit a wall.
Until biology intervenes. In December of 2014, William Ed Smith passes away.
Okay. And 3 years after his death, in August of 2017, the Moline Police Department makes a highly calculated move. They call a press conference, and they formally, publicly name the deceased William Smith as a person of interest in Trudy Appleby's disappearance.
That press conference is step one of the psychological pressure campaign. You have to ask, why publicly name a dead man? He can't be put on trial.
Right. What's the point?
But by naming him, the police are sending a very loud, clear signal to the rest of the criminal community. They are saying, we know what happened here. The conspiracy is unraveling. And the primary threat to your safety, the man who might have killed you for talking, is now dead.
Here's where the strategy gets incredibly interesting, because it creates this intended domino effect. They let that simmer for 3 years. Then, in 2020, police take it a massive step further.
Step two.
They publicly name 2 more men, David Whipple, who happened to be William Smith's son-in-law, and Jamison Fisher. The police basically get on a microphone, broadcast it to every news station in the Quad Cities and say, we believe these 2 men know a lot more than they have shared.
Which is brilliant tactical warfare. It wasn't just a routine update for the evening news viewers. It was a targeted missile fired directly into the local criminal underworld.
Stirring the pot.
The police were putting a spotlight on Whipple and Fisher, effectively telling them, we are looking right at you, and your associates know we are looking at you. It breeds paranoia, it makes them sloppy, it fractures alliances.
And then the second domino falls.
Yeah.
In August of 2022, David Whipple dies,
leaving Jamison Fisher as the absolute sole living suspect from that core original group of 3 men.
And right around this time, Fisher's own life choices catch up with him. He ends up incarcerated in Iowa, serving time on completely unrelated drug convictions.
Now, I want you to think about what that specific sequence of events does to the threat matrix for the witnesses we were just analyzing.
Everything shifts.
William Smith, the guy seen in the car, dead. David Whipple, the drug connect, dead. Jamison Fisher, the enforcer who breaks windows and takes collateral, locked in a steel cage in another state.
The board is clear.
Suddenly, for the very first time in nearly 30 years, the window of safety finally cracks open. The oppressive environment of fear was finally neutralized enough for people like Tiffany Fuller, Rodney Fauch, and Mandy West to safely go on the record with investigators.
It's an incredible lesson in patience. The police couldn't force them to talk in 1996, so they essentially waited out the lifespan of the criminal network, shaking a tree every few years, waiting for the branches of that alliance to rot and weaken, and collecting whatever evidence fell out.
It is the grim reality of cold case investigations. You are often just waiting for the statute of limitations on loyalty to expire, which usually happens when allegiances literally die.
But this brings us to the most massive hurdle of the entire case. We have witness testimony. We have a compelling motive rooted in the meth trade. We have delayed confessions driven by the opportune deaths of co-conspirators. But witness testimony, no matter how emotionally devastating, no matter how perfectly it aligns with the timeline, is not physical evidence.
No, it's not.
And if you are an ambitious prosecutor trying to convict a man of first-degree murder, physical evidence is the absolute gold standard.
So while these witnesses are slowly, agonizingly finding their courage over 3 decades, where was the forensics team? What was the science doing?
The forensics teams across multiple agencies were busy executing what I would classify as an exhaustive, decades-long campaign of forensic archaeology. Because to prosecute a murder without a victim's body, the state of Illinois has a very specific, incredibly high legal burden they have to meet before a judge will even let them go to trial. Let's look at the physical searches. because the lengths they went to are staggering. They didn't just walk through the woods with flashlights.
Not at all.
Let's start in August of 2012. Investigators brought heavy excavation equipment, backhoes, and bulldozers out to a place called Dynamite Island, which is a small, rugged island in the Rock River, and they basically tore the earth apart looking for her remains.
You have to understand the environmental science of river islands. The topography changes wildly over decades. The Rock River floods, sediment shifts, soil is deposited, erosion strips banks away.
Right, it's not static.
Searching an island for human remains after 16 years isn't a surface search. It requires literal, heavy-duty geological excavation.
But they don't find her. Fast forward to October 2017, shortly after publicly naming William Smith. They bring highly specialized cadaver dogs out to properties associated with Smith on Campbell's Island. And this is where it gets chilling. The dogs actually alerted.
Yes. Let's talk about the biology of what those dogs are doing.
What are they actually smelling?
Cadaver dogs are not just tracking a generic scent. They are explicitly trained to detect volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. These are the highly specific chemical byproducts created by human decomposition.
Okay.
What's deeply fascinating about soil science is that VOCs can linger in the dirt for decades, long after the physical remains have been moved or have completely skeletonized and dissolved.
So the dog sitting down and alerting means they smell the chemical signature of human death, but it doesn't guarantee you're going to find a skeleton right beneath the surface with a shovel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Especially considering that several witness statements claim Jamison Fisher actively bragged about moving the body multiple times to avoid detection.
Wow.
So the dogs might have just found a temporary burial site, a place where the body rested long enough to leach VOCs into the soil before being relocated.
But the most intense, almost sci-fi sounding part of this forensic investigation happens in 2018. Police track down and seize a boat in Dubuque, Iowa.
A very specific boat.
Right, but not just any boat. It's a 22-year-old marine vessel that was directly linked to William Smith and his associates back in 1996. Mandy West said she saw Fisher carrying a lifeless girl off a boat. So they seize this ancient boat and ship it to the FBI laboratories in Springfield, Illinois, and eventually to the Premier Labs in Quantico, Virginia.
This is where the absolute bleeding edge of forensic science truly shines. Think about the conditions. You have a marine vessel that has been exposed to the harsh elements of the Midwest for over 2 decades.
22 years of weather.
It has been subjected to river water, intense UV light from the sun, freezing winters, boiling summers. From a biological standpoint, moisture and UV light are the notorious absolute destroyers of DNA molecules. They break down the chemical bonds rapidly.
So finding a clean drop of blood on the deck is impossible.
Impossible. But boats are not just flat surfaces. They have deep sheltered internal crevices, the bilge, the spaces under the floorboards, inside sealed mechanical compartments.
The places the sun and the rain never reach.
Exactly. The FBI technicians employed a painstaking microscopic process called microswabbing, scouring those dark, oily recesses for microscopic biological fragments, a stray skin cell, a microscopic drop of fluid trapped in a seam.
That's incredible.
But finding a degraded cell is only half the battle. You have to be able to identify it. To prepare for this astronomical long shot, the Moline Police Department collaborated with the UNTCHI, the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification.
I read about them. They are basically the global heavyweights when it comes to degraded, impossible DNA.
They are the absolute leaders. The UNTCHI took fresh DNA samples from Trudy's living parents and her brother. Using those samples, they built a highly complex, high-resolution, multi-generational genetic profile of Trudy.
So they have a map ready.
The strategy was brilliant. If the FBI managed to pull even a heavily fragmented, partially destroyed fraction of a cell from deep inside that bird's bilge, the UNTCHI had the mathematical models ready to definitively match it to her family line.
Now, the sources mentioned Detective John Griffin stating publicly that they got a promising swab from that 22-year-old boat, though the exact genetic results are tightly sealed for the upcoming trial.
They're holding that close to the chest.
But even with that swab, the digging didn't stop.
Yeah.
As late as August 2023, law enforcement executed another major search warrant, bringing equipment in to excavate a residential backyard in Kelowna, Illinois. And again, no human remains were found.
Which brings up a very logical, very critical question that I'm sure many people listening have right now. Why keep digging?
Yeah, why?
If you spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, mobilize heavy machinery, seize boats, and keep coming up empty-handed year after year, why keep spending the taxpayers' money and the department's manpower?
Right. From the outside, it seems like a massive PR nightmare to keep holding press conferences announcing these huge searches, only to quietly admit a week later that you found nothing but dirt.
It looks like a failure to the public, but it is actually a vital necessity for the prosecution. It's not about PR, it's about jurisprudence.
Explain that.
In a no-body homicide case, the prosecution cannot just walk into court and say, well, she's gone, so he must have killed her. They must formally prove to a judge and jury that they have absolutely exhausted every single technological, geographic, scientific, and financial avenue available to them.
I see. So the empty hole in the ground isn't a failure. The empty hole is actually the evidence itself.
Precisely. It fulfills the legal burden of exhaustion. By thoroughly documenting all these failed searches, the state's attorney can look at the jury and say, we used heavy machinery, we used the FBI, we used the best DNA lab in the world, we used cadaver dogs, we looked everywhere human science allows us to look.
And therefore,
The fact that we do not have a body is not due to a lack of police effort. The absence of the body is an intentional, successful act of deliberate concealment by the defendant. You are proving the negative.
that is fascinating. So, armed with 30 years of circumstantial evidence, a devastating motive tied to the meth trade, a string of delayed confessions driven by the opportune deaths of co-conspirators, and a documented, ironclad history of exhausted forensic searches.
The prosecution was finally ready,
Yeah, they were finally ready to make their ultimate move.
which launches us directly into the legal battlefield of the 2025 arrest and the impending 2026 trial.
Let's break down the charges. On August 13th, 2025, Jamison Albert Fisher is formally indicted by a grand jury. He is hit with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of concealment of a homicidal death.
Right.
But if you're paying close attention to the timeline we just laid out, you might notice something noticeably missing from that list: kidnapping charges.
And that is purely due to the rigid mechanics of the statute of limitations.
Time ran out.
In Illinois, as in most places, the crime of murder has no statute of limitations. You can be charged 50 years later. But kidnapping, even the kidnapping of a child, does have a ticking clock.
So they just can't charge him for it.
After nearly 30 years, that prosecutorial window completely closed. The state cannot legally charge him with the initial abduction anymore, but the murder charges stick forever.
Following the indictment, Fisher is extradited from Iowa, where he was still serving time for those unrelated drug charges, and brought back across the river to Illinois. And the pretrial legal maneuvers begin almost immediately.
He didn't waste any time.
No. In early 2026, he stands before a judge and pleads not guilty. His defense team immediately goes on the offensive. He demands a county-funded private investigator because he claims, as an indigent defendant, he's unfairly out-resourced by the massive machinery of the state.
Standard defense move?
He files a handwritten motion demanding the recusal of Judge Norma Kozlerich. But his biggest, most aggressive move is demanding a complete change of venue out of Henry County.
And to understand why his defense team is fighting so hard on location and procedure, we really need to dissect the fundamental significance of a nobody prosecution in the state of Illinois. The defense's entire overarching strategy is going to rest heavily on an ancient legal principle known as corpus delicti.
Let's define that, because it sounds like a spell from Harry Potter, but it is actually the single biggest hurdle the state faces in this courtroom.
Corpus delicti is Latin. It translates literally to the body of the crime. It is a foundational principle in Western law that dictates a conviction cannot be based solely on a defendant's confession or the isolated testimony of witnesses.
You need more than just words.
Exactly. There must be independent, corroborating evidence that a crime actually occurred in the first place. This law was originally designed centuries ago to prevent people from being executed based on forced confessions for murders that never actually happened.
Makes sense historically.
Traditionally, in a homicide case, the physical dead body is the corpus delicti. It proves someone died by unnatural causes.
So the defense is going to stand up and argue, you don't have a body, you don't have a crime scene, you can't even definitively prove this girl is dead. She was 11, she could have run away.
Yeah.
Without a physical body, there is no proof of a murder, therefore there is no murder to prosecute.
Exactly. They will attack the very premise that a homicide took place at all. Now, while modern nobody prosecutions are technically allowed in Illinois, they are statistically incredibly rare and notoriously difficult to win.
That's an uphill battle.
State's attorney Catherine Runty cannot rely on a coroner's report. She has to build a web of circumstantial evidence, the drug debt, the history of violence, the timeline of the silver sedan, the terrified witnesses, and weave it so incredibly tight that the only logical conclusion a rational jury can possibly reach is that Trudy Appleby was murdered by Jamison Fisher.
Quick procedural question on that, actually.
Sure.
If the abduction started in the driveway in Moline, and Moline is in Rock Island County, why is the trial happening in Henry County? Why is Henry County State's Attorney Catherine Runty the lead prosecutor instead of Rock Island?
It's a really fascinating jurisdictional web that depends entirely on witness testimony. Under Illinois criminal law, a crime is typically prosecuted in the jurisdiction where the culminating final act occurred.
Oh, the actual murder.
Yes. According to the specific confessions, the state has gathered specifically what Fisher allegedly told his cellmate and his ex-girlfriend. He allegedly strangled Trudy at a location in Kelowna, Illinois.
And Kelowna is in Henry County.
Kelowna sits just across the county line inside Henry County. Therefore, even though the Moline Police Department in Rock Island County spearheaded the entire 30-year investigation, Henry County technically has the jurisdictional authority over the murder trial itself.
Got it. Okay, so circling back to Fisher's pretrial demand, he wants the trial moved completely out of Henry County. Why? What is the argument there?
His defense team is aggressively arguing that the community climate in the entirety of the Quad Cities area is hopelessly, irrevocably prejudiced against him.
They think the jury pool is tainted.
They are filing motions citing decades of relentless media coverage, billboards featuring Trudy's face towering over the highways, annual news specials, and an overwhelming, saturated public awareness of the case. They claim that finding 12 impartial jurors in that specific geographic area is a statistical impossibility.
They're basically saying, everyone in this town already thinks my client is guilty because they've been staring at her missing poster every time they drive to the grocery store for the last 30 years.
That's the argument.
How does the prosecution fight that motion?
They fight it by looking to establish legal precedent. The state counters with rulings from the Illinois Supreme Court, specifically relying on a famous precedent called People v. Kirchner.
What does that say?
The Kirchner standard establishes a very important distinction for the jury selection process, known as voir dire. The precedent states that in the modern era, jurors do not need to live under a rock. They don't need to be completely 100% ignorant of a high-profile case to serve on a jury.
It's the difference between an ignorant jury and an impartial jury.
Precisely. To be impartial, potential jurors simply need to demonstrate during questioning that they possess the cognitive ability and moral willingness to set aside their pre-existing knowledge of the media coverage and judge the defendant solely, exclusively on the evidence presented within the four walls of the courtroom.
That makes sense.
The state argues that moving the trial is unnecessary and that the residents of Henry County actually have a vested, legitimate civic interest in seeing justice served for a major crime that occurred in their own backyard.
You know, Fisher's complaint about the saturated community climate and the billboards is actually deeply, almost poetically ironic.
How so?
Because his complaint brings us directly to the most vital, the most emotional, and perhaps the most powerful element of this entire 30-year saga.
Yeah.
We've talked about the law, we've talked about the meth trade, we've talked about the science, but none of it happens without 10,584 days of public memory.
What's fascinating here is the paradox of the defense's argument regarding the venue change. They are complaining in court that the community cared too much. They are saying the town was too invested.
Right.
But that massive, unrelenting community care is exactly, literally why we are even discussing this case today.
For 3 full decades, the Quad Cities community absolutely refused to let Trudy Appleby's name fade away into the archives. Her uncle, Ray Edelman, stepped up and became the unrelenting torchbearer for this cause.
He really did.
Every single year, on August 21st, there were organized vigils. Hundreds of people gathering at the First Baptist Church, marching in downtown Moline. They raised money to put up massive billboards on the interstates.
Year after year.
They organized with local reporters to ensure her face was in the news cycle every single August without fail.
And we have to analyze the profound practical investigative impact of that sociology. It wasn't just a grieving family holding candles to find closure. It functioned as a highly effective strategic asset for law enforcement.
It kept the heat on.
Those vigils, those marches, those billboards did exactly what they were subconsciously designed to do.
Yeah?
They kept an immense, unyielding amount of political and public pressure on the Moline Police Department and the FBI to never, ever close the file.
Because it is incredibly easy for a cold case, especially one with no body and no physical crime scene, to just end up in a cardboard box in a basement evidence room when the public stops asking about it.
Exactly. When budgets get tight, police departments allocate resources to active, solvable cases. The community's refusal to forget literally funded the continued investigation.
That's a great point.
Furthermore, we have to look at the psychological warfare aspect of it. That constant 30-year public visibility terrified the suspects.
Oh, definitely.
Every time Fisher or Whipple drove down the highway and saw that billboard, it was a constant, glaring reminder that they hadn't gotten away with it, that the community was still actively hunting them.
And most importantly, returning to our witnesses like Mandy West and Tiffany Fuller, that public pressure signaled to those terrified people holding the secrets that they were not alone.
It showed them support.
It showed them that if they ever found the courage to finally speak up against this violent drug connect, the entire community would be standing right there to support them.
The community essentially acted as the heartbeat of the investigation when the physical evidence went flatline.
I really want you, the listener, to think about that.
Yeah.
If Uncle Ray and the Quad Cities community had just given up after 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, Jamison Fisher would likely never face a jury.
He'd walk free forever.
The police would have lacked the public mandate and the budgetary justification to keep funding FBI microscopic boat swabs and heavy equipment island excavations. The witnesses would have assumed no one cared anymore and taken their secrets to the grave.
It is a profound testament to the mechanics of collective memory.
So after unpacking all of this, what does this all mean? We are staring down the barrel of a 2026 trial that is going to test the absolute fundamental limits of the American judicial system.
We are looking at a perfect synthesis of three distinct, powerful forces colliding in one courtroom.
Let's hear them.
You have the unrelenting evolution of forensic science, which allowed investigators to pull potential microscopic evidence from a 22-year-old boat and legally prove they exhausted every physical search.
Number one.
You have the brilliant, strategic, psychological pressure applied by law enforcement, waiting out the deaths of criminal co-conspirators to finally make the environment safe for traumatized witnesses to talk.
Number two.
And at the base of it all, you have an unwavering local community that point-blank refused to let an 11-year-old girl be forgotten by time.
It is monumental. It's not just the tragic story of a missing girl from 1996 anymore. It is a sprawling testament to building a murder case completely out of thin air, relying on the science of memory, the remnants of a drug trade, and circumstantial persistence 30 years after the fact.
And it leaves us with a truly chilling legal and philosophical reality as this trial approaches.
What's that?
In a nobody case like this, with the corpus delicti in question, the jury isn't just deciding if a man committed a crime. They are being asked to decide something much deeper.
Oh.
They are being asked if the collective memory of a community and the delayed, trauma-soaked courage of witnesses is strong enough to legally stand in for physical evidence. If Jamison Fisher is convicted, it proves a terrifying but ultimately empowering point. You can destroy a body, you can hide the physical evidence, but you cannot destroy a community's memory.
That is a profoundly heavy thought to end on. Can memory convict where physical evidence fails? In Henry County, Illinois, we are going to find out.
It's going to be historic.
But right now, we want to hear from you.
Hmm.
This is a case that hinges entirely on the reliability of the human mind over 3 decades. Do you think 30-year-old witness testimony, combined with the suspect's history of violence and the meth trade drug debt motive, is enough to overcome the complete lack of physical remains in a modern court of law?
It's a tough call.
Does the defense's corpus delicti argument hold weight for you, or does the circumstantial evidence paint a clear enough picture for a conviction? Let us know down in the comments.
It is a debate that legal scholars, psychologists, and true crime analysts will be having for years to come, and your perspective on how a jury might react is incredibly relevant to the conversation.
If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Trudy Appleby investigation, be sure to hit that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an upload as we continue to explore these incredible sources. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you in the next one.